So the ancient Egyptians, here's the story he's selling. 12,000 years ago, whenever the Sphinx was made, somehow it survived the Nile floods and the Nile flows, and then the Egyptians found it, and they renovated it by putting blocks on it. So Schoch agrees with me that those are phase one blocks. Those were put there 4,500 years ago, but he's still saying it's erosion. And then they recarved the head from this other one and made a nice pristine Sphinx, and they made a nice pristine valley temple. For some odd reason, they never touched the sidewalls. Why would they do that? Why would they renovate everything and leave untouched the eroded sidewalls, which is the evidence that Schoch's pointing to?
I think it's always a good idea to give everybody the benefit of the doubt and to let everybody express their best arguments. I personally, by using Occam's razor, think the most plausible explanation to many of the wondrous and mysteriously advanced megalithic structures all over the world is that they were built a long, long time ago, many thousands of years before the textbooks tell us that they were built, and then found by later civilizations. Now, my guest today in this episode, Robert Schneiker, he has, for the most part, no problem believing that these structures were built exactly when, or more or less when textbooks tell us that they were built. And he demystifies and sometimes almost banalizes many of the wondrous features and artifacts in a way that almost feel a little bit alien to me. But I am admittedly not totally conventional. Robert is an honest truth seeker. It's obvious. And you may find, whatever you think, that you can learn a thing or two from him, not least about your own blind spots. I certainly did. There are some concrete, down-to-earth questions that probably have right or wrong answers. We will dwell in this episode around the Sphinx, for instance, and there are many details there. But I think many of these questions, they have kind of a left brain answer and a more intuitive right brain answer. It's a matter of inner and outer worldview. It's about seeing what you want to see and finding what you are able to find when you rule out certain things. And this goes for both sides, for all sides. Whatever you believe and not believe, it is all very interesting. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is Mind the Shift, and I'm Anders. Those of you who have followed this channel, you know that the topic of lost ancient civilizations is a prominent one. And this episode might act a little bit like devil's advocate on this matter, or maybe not. We'll see how it goes. My guest today is Bob Schneiker. He's a geophysicist and a self-taught programmer who has developed a software for the cleaning up of contaminants, which is now industry standard, and he has presented papers on the Sphinx, Göbekli Tepe, paleomagnetism, geophysics, and groundwater modeling. Welcome to the show, Bob.
Thanks for having me.
So did I get that correct, the little CV there?
Yeah, that was very good. Yeah, you covered the things that I do. I studied geophysics. I got a master's degree in geophysics from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I was really studying petroleum geophysics, and just at the time I was going to get a job, the oil industry just collapsed and everyone was getting laid off. So I ended up working in the environmental industry. And for me, computers were always this really great tool, and I had to figure out how does that tool work? And I never thought I'd end up developing a software package, but I ended up doing modeling for the state of Wisconsin to develop their baseline cleanup standards, and then other states followed suit, and I created a software package to make it easier to do that. So yeah.
Fascinating. You did it. And then you ended up doing a lot of other stuff that has to do with this famous topic of lost civilizations, or possibly not lost civilizations. We'll see. So there's a lot to cover, and I know that you have a few bullet points that you want to talk about. I suppose we should start with the Sphinx. You first, and just bear with me if I give the background here. You can correct me if I get this wrong, but I think you first became aware of the controversy or controversy, I don't know how to pronounce that word, anyway, regarding the age of the Sphinx after watching a program on PBS. And as many listeners and viewers will know, was another geophysicist, Robert Schoch, who has been a guest on this show, who redated the Sphinx radically some 30 years ago. It's a little bit more than 30 years now. And as far as I understand, you first thought that, having watched that certain aspects of the Sphinx would be a good example of how contaminants spread. But this grew into something much larger. So tell us, where did that first encounter with the legends around the Sphinx lead you, and why?
So, yeah, I mean, you basically got the story. It's slightly different because I knew nothing about Schoch. What I was watching was Nova, and it was Mark Lehner was on a Nova episode, and I really just had it on in the background. I really wasn't that interested in the Sphinx. I mean, Schoch said that. I thought he was very right. Most geologists aren't very interested in the Sphinx and what its age is. We're interested in other things. So, but it was interesting enough that I left it on in the background. And then at some point, I was working on something, and at some point, Mark Lehner started explaining how the shallow groundwater.
Just tell the audience who Mark Lehner is. Sorry.
So Mark Lehner is well, he's got an interesting story. So Mark Lehner is a Egyptologist, archaeologist, and he originally went to Egypt, fully funded by the Edgar Cayce Foundation, and he went there to prove that there was a lost civilization and that the Hall of Records was located below the left paw of the Sphinx, or somewhere in that area. So he did geophysics, he did all sorts of things, worked with a number of different people, and drilled, and found nothing but weathered limestone. And I asked him how long it took, because he switched like almost instantly from real thinking that he thought he was going to reveal to the world the truth. And this is a quote that he said, and I pressed him on this, within hours, a day at the most, he moved on. And to me, that's a scientist, where you have this idea that you think is what's going on. Anyway, so that's who Mark Lehner is. And he eventually went on to the University of Chicago, got his PhD in archaeology and specifically on the Sphinx. So his dissertation is all about the Sphinx. And you can find it online. So he was explaining on Nova how the shallow groundwater is wicking up and causing the sidewalls where he was standing, and a little bit of the Sphinx to erode. What happens is the water wicks up and salt accumulates in the pore spaces. And then through time, the salt crystals build up pressure and it causes the rock to exfoliate what kind of looks like giant Pringles potato chips. And he was there's a really cool part where he's just like putting his hand underneath and he goes, I hate to do this, and a big piece of the sidewall comes off, and that's what gives it that rounded appearance. That isn't precipitation. That's clearly occurring because of the shallow groundwater. So my day job is, as you pointed out, contaminant modeling. So everyone thinks of rain falling on the ground and picking up contamination like a coffee percolator and carrying it down to the groundwater. Well, here's the opposite, and it does happen, where the water, where contamination, or salt in this case, is wicking up off the water table, rising up through the soil and evaporating at the surface. And geologists and engineers I do training, they have a difficult time understanding that concept. So I was going to use the Sphinx as an example, and that was it. I knew nothing about any controversy on its age. I knew nothing about Schoch. And when I did learn that, I thought, oh my goodness, he is thinking that this wicking groundwater is the reason that there's a lost civilization. So I did my research on that to find out, no, that's not possible. That erosion that is happening today, it's a little bit less now, but that erosion that's basically happening today cannot possibly explain why the Sphinx looks the way that it does. That was my conclusion, and that was my first paper that I presented at the Geological Society of America meeting in Vancouver back in 2014. So it was only when I started looking into it that I found Schoch and got me onto this tangent. And I was like, well, he can't be right. And now I'm kind of hooked in the same way I think you are in a subject. I'm like, okay, I'm going to figure this out. So the fact that the Sphinx is eroded, that everyone thinks that the Sphinx is eroded, is not new. That doesn't go back to Schoch and West. Everyone believes that the Sphinx was eroded, and that's what created the undulating patterns that we see in what's called member 2 on the Sphinx, the body, not the lower paws and not the head, but basically that section. So where I've lost my train of thought here a second. So that
you started looking into the theory that Robert Schoch has and that John Anthony West had before him, that the erosion was from water and not from wind, as everybody else thought, something like that. Okay.
Well, so that's, yeah, exactly. So that's, thank you. So what all the archaeologists were certain that the Sphinx had been eroded. And the thing is they actually pushed the erosion into a tinier time frame, because they're saying that it was eroded sometime between when it was constructed about 4,500 years ago, and then about 3,400 years ago by Thutmose IV, he repaired the Sphinx. So it's really in this 1,100-year period that all of that, at least the majority of the erosion, is occurring. And I found this really interesting because, I mean, again, Schoch is right that it's been a desert for roughly the last 5,000 years. So how can you get water erosion on the Sphinx? And that's where what Schoch says, this is clearly water erosion. And so you can't get a real date on it based on his research, but he's saying just because it was water erosion, it must be older. And it's just a fascinating thing that the Sahara switches back and forth between green and desert about every 20,000 years because of perturbations on Earth's orbit.
Yeah, because that's I mean, that was his main point, because because the last time that area was not a desert when it was green, when there was a lot of precipitation, was somewhere from 12,000 years ago to 5,500 years ago. So then, I mean, his conclusion was that it must have been built during that period, because the erosion is clearly from precipitation, from water, and not
exactly.
From,
That's exactly it. So that's why he dates it older. West takes it further. He goes back to the previous Green Sahara. So there would be another interglacial or desert Sahara period, and then go to the previous one. So he's making it like 34,000 or something years old, something in that neighborhood. But so the thing is that if you look at, have you been there?
Oh, I've been there once, but I was a kid. I was 7 years old, so I can't really remember details. I have a photo of me on the Great Pyramid there, but I should go back again. Yeah,
I'm sure you remember. I mean, because it's very memorable. Memorable.
Well,
experience.
I do remember some parts of it, but I mean, I was Anyway, 7 years old. It's you don't look for the things that you would look for now when you're middle aged.
So the reason I asked is because if you look at Giza, it's really not a plateau. I don't know why everyone.
No, it's a cuesta. You taught me that on your website.
Yeah. So I don't like that term. I think everyone's like, why are you using a Spanish word? And then it's an escarpment on the backside. So I'll use the term anticline, but technically it's a cuesta. Yes. And so what that is so to an untrained eye, it looks from one side, it looks like a plateau. So if you went to the northwest of Giza and looked at it, you'd say, well, that's clearly a plateau. If you looked at it from basically the east, you'd be like, okay, that's a cuesta, because you can just see it sloping down from all the pyramids down towards the Sphinx. So the Sphinx is actually, and this is the question that I had right away, was how can there be water beneath the Sphinx when the Sphinx is in the desert? And the answer is the Sphinx is in the Nile floodplain. And so that's a really important aspect of the history of the Sphinx. If you're going to make it older, it's the reason that the water was wicking up underneath it. It's only because of the Aswan Dam today that was finished in 1970 that the annual floods don't come through and occasionally actually turn the Sphinx into an island in the Nile River. So during this Green Sahara period, as it's called, and you had the dates right, the Sphinx is in the Nile floodplain. So right now, the Nile puts out about the 10th of the output of flow of the Amazon. But during a Green Sahara period, all of the wadis through Egypt, there's like 1,000 miles of desert now, all those wadis become active with streams, at least seasonally. And there was another main tributary called the Yellow Nile. It's known as Wadi Hawar today. And what happens during a Green Sahara period is the Nile challenges the Amazon as the most powerful river on Earth. They're about the same length. It goes back and forth which one's actually longer. But the basin, the collection basin for the Nile is about a third of that of the Amazon. But nonetheless, it puts out a tremendous amount of water. Had the Sphinx existed at any point during the Green Sahara period, it would no longer exist because it would have been destroyed by these massive flows and floods coming down the Nile Valley. So, I mean, so that's part of the thing. So my story was this, stepping back a little bit. When I looked at this and I realized that there's no erosion occurring on the Sphinx. There's no way that there's been any erosion in the last 4,500 years that would make the Sphinx look the way it does. Out of frustration, kind of, I started at the beginning of what's the geologic story here? When was this rock deposited? What's happened to this rock since it was deposited? And that led me to look at all sorts of things. But at the end, I still couldn't, I'm kind of cutting to the chase here. I couldn't really find any way in which the Sphinx could have been eroded. And I knew all sorts of things. So, and I came to conclusions that other people did. Like George Reisner said that the top of the head of the Sphinx marked the original elevation at the Giza Cuesta. So Schoch's head, when he shows a lion's head, when he depicts that, I'm saying that's impossible because there's not enough high quality limestone above where the Sphinx head is to ever have made a bigger head. In fact, it comes down to the fact that that head seems to be a block of fractured limestone, and that's what set the size of the statue. And that the reason that the face has the profile it does is because if you look, there's a series of fractures and they're not quite straight. So that gives the profile to the face. And if you look at the face casually, you'll see there's a bedding plane at the eyebrows, there's a bedding plane at the lips, there's a bedding plane at the nose. So they altered the proportions of the pharaoh to match the geology with what they had.
There's no joint between the head and the body. I mean, I know that they refurbished the head a little bit in the 1920s because they put cement on the neck of it, I think.
Yeah.
But I mean, if it was the case that it was originally a lion's head and it fell off and then they put up this instead, there would be you would see some kind of a joint. I mean, some kind of a division between the part on the head and the body, but you don't, do you? Or
well, I was going to just let me see
a dividing line of some kind.
Let me see if I can do some screen sharing here. Oh, I'm on the wrong. So you can see that there's a series of 3 fractures on the back of the Sphinx.
Yeah.
And the one right behind the head, and you can see that they're not quite vertical and they're somewhat uniformly spaced. They're not exactly. So if you could see fractures in limestone like this from the air, if they were mapped, the geology of the area that would look very much like a shattered safety glass, where you'd see these lines somewhat parallel, somewhat in patterns. So if you take that and put another, where the next one, can you see the cursor?
Sure.
Okay, so you've got this here. This is called the major fissure, and then you got a fracture here. And you got a fracture here. Well, there'd be another one about here.
At the front?
And that's the face. Yeah.
Behind
just I know where. But so the profile of the face basically follows this fracture right here, and then the top of this head is what was the top of was the original elevation at Giza. So the surface that you see at Giza today, that is not a natural surface. When the Egyptians came there, it had been exposed for millions of years. It had been eroded down, and there had been drainage, all sorts of different features. It wouldn't be that relatively smooth cuesta that you see today, that smooth limestone. That's all been quarried. And it was quarried to make the pyramids, and it's this high quality limestone. It's why they chose this location, or one of the reasons they chose this location is because of that high quality member 3 limestone of the Sphinx head.
Okay, great.
So anyway, so if you look at this, and this is the major fissure while we're on this slide, you can see there's a person here for scale. So this major fissure here, if you could see it from the opposite side, and I have looked and looked and looked, and nobody's taken a picture of this huge gap here. And according to Mark Lehner, when he was doing his dissertation, this layer here, that's the layer of the head, would have originally have covered this portion of the member 2 limestone. So, and they would carve this from the top down. You wouldn't need scaffolding then. So you'd start, and then they removed these blocks and dragged them downhill. They didn't drag these heavy blocks uphill. They dragged them downhill to the Sphinx temple and to the Valley Temple. And then they as they worked on it, they encountered this giant gap here, which I would call a cave, because a cave is a void in the rock large enough for a person to enter. Mark Lehner actually describes how he had him, it goes even below the surface, below the level of the enclosure floor. And Mark had himself lowered head first on a rope to examine what's down there. So according to Mark, that's what caused them to elongate the Sphinx.
Oh, yeah.
Because they wanted to put the rear paws right about here, and that's where they
discovered some weaknesses in the rock there, the body.
So yeah, so what they did then is they just elongated it, and that way the rear paws, by the way, are carved directly out of the limestone, and they are not eroded. Yeah. So anybody who says there's erosion, and in fact, if you were to look at that member 1 limestone, which is it's just at the west end of the Sphinx, if you look at it, there's actually a shelf. So they put a shelf here, and then I'm going to use my phone. I think, you can see that. And they put that on a shelf because they needed a secure level platform on which to put the blocks. And the blocks then covered the member 2 limestone from the beginning.
Okay.
So there's no question that there's...
So the undulating structure that you see here, the reason why it looks like that is not that it's eroded, but that it actually looked that way from the beginning, because limestone... Or you write somewhere that they actually originally probably added some high quality blocks to make it smoother, to make the surface smoother, but that was looted later. Is that correct?
Correct. That's exactly it. So Mark Lehner, looking at this, and the blocks are they're a particular type of limestone, and that quarry had been depleted by the time of Thutmose IV. So everyone is like, well, where did he get the blocks? 1,100 years later, those blocks are gone. So the thought is, so Mark looked at that and said, well, he took the blocks from the causeway. So there's a causeway that goes from the Valley Temple up to the Pyramid of Khafre, and that had blocks, limestone blocks on it. And he's saying Mark Lehner is saying that Thutmose IV took those blocks. And Mark looked at this undulating pattern and at the blocks, and the only thing that caused him not to assign those blocks to the original structure was the erosion beneath. So he's saying everything about it, everything about the way the Sphinx is and those blocks and the history of the area, that the blocks were original. But he could not explain why this undulating pattern was on the Sphinx body.
Yeah.
And so that's what I've explained. So I went through and I learned all about the history of the Sphinx. I can get into some really cool things. But if you look right here where I'm pointing, can you see the cursor?
Yeah, I think so.
So right there at the neck, this is patched with concrete, as you were saying earlier. So this is where the greatest degree of erosion is occurring. But it's not erosion. So the question is, what would cause this? You could maybe see that being caused by wind, and definitely the Sphinx was buried up to its back in sand. So this could be wind erosion, but it's not precipitation, because if precipitation were falling from above, it couldn't possibly erode like that. And that was a clue. And I finally went and I watched Nova again, the same episode, when I was really frustrated and I couldn't figure out how this was made. And then I saw how they actually carved, and it was with 2-handed pounders. So they had a rock of about, if you can see my hands, about that big, and they would just flake the rock off by pounding onto this limestone. And part of this limestone is so soft you can crumble it in your fingers.
Mm.
And then they use stone hammers, which would be a smaller rock with sticks tied to it, not just cut and used like a hammer. And they use copper chisels just for detailed work. Well, if you're coming onto a limestone that's so soft that you can crumble it in your fingers, and using those ancient techniques, these are not advanced techniques. That's why it looks the way it does, is because they use these ancient technology of just flaking the rock off. That's what created this undulating pattern that everyone has misidentified as erosion.
Yeah, well, I guess that makes sense. Yeah, when you think about it, because it looks. I mean, either it's been constructed with pretty primitive methods, or it is extremely ancient. I mean, either of those two. That's the reason why it would look like this. So, I mean, and you go for the the first possible. But in all fairness to Robert Schoch, I think he was focusing mainly on the enclosure of the Sphinx when he talked about the erosion, precipitation erosion, and you don't mention the enclosure very much on your website, at least when I read about it, as far as I can recall. So isn't that the case that this is what he's actually pointing to primarily, the erosion on the enclosure, which is vertical and it looks like precipitation erosion?
Well, exactly. I mean, in total agreement. And if you look at, and I've done this in some slides, I don't have one right now, where you take the sidewall and you put it on the Sphinx, you realize that the sidewall looks different than the Sphinx. It has that more rounded appearance than the more angular erosion as it supposedly as on the Sphinx. So the question is why? So yeah, Robert Schoch points out that you've got these sidewalls. It brings up a really interesting question. Well, a couple. So again, there's a depiction where Robert Schoch is showing what the Sphinx had originally looked like. And then there would be 14 meters of erosion from the nape of the neck, the back of the neck, to that notch at the back of the neck that I was just pointing in that other picture. And that's all from erosion by precipitation? How? And then if erosion is going to erode the Sphinx body, again, as I was just pointing out, why didn't it erode the floor? When water enters, comes off a waterfall or flows down the side very steep, it doesn't erode the surface, that steep surface. It erodes hardest where it hits on the floor, and it creates what are plunge pools. So why are there no plunge pools, and why is there no erosion on the enclosure floor of the Sphinx? That's impossible. Again. Water doesn't.
So how do you explain the apparent erosion on the walls of the enclosure? What's your explanation for that kind of pattern that you see there?
So that's the same thing. They used, again, the same two-handed pounders and the stone hammers, and they created that surface there. And then it has an imprint on top of it, without question, of the shallow groundwater. So all of the evidence, all the tool marks, if they use copper chisels on it, all that's long gone because of this shallow groundwater that's waking up and causing the Sphinx enclosure with the sidewalls to have that more rounded appearance. And that's why the sidewalls are rounded and the Sphinx is more angular in its so-called erosion.
Yeah.
But here's one of the questions that I have that I would ask Schoch, because he makes the assumption, first off, that the walls of the enclosure were vertical and have eroded back. There's no evidence of that. No one can say with certain that that's one way or the other. Personally, I think that they probably sloped at about the same angle as the pyramids. But even a bigger question is, so when the ancient Egyptians came,
why do you deduct that they sloped? Sorry.
Oh, because there's no, it just seems to fit. I mean, that's just my take on it. That's when I look at it, I'm like, if I were building this, what would I do? And it's neither here nor there. It's just my opinion that I don't think I know there's no evidence that it was ever vertical, and there's no evidence that I'm right. But if I had to choose between the two, I would argue it probably wasn't vertical to begin with. But that's just my opinion, and I make that very clear. That's just an opinion. But I got a bigger question. So we're looking, Schoch points to, as you were just doing, points to the side walls of the enclosure that look eroded. Yet the head was recarved, and the Sphinx temple, the blocks there were recarved according to Schoch. All this stuff was recarved. So the ancient Egyptians, here's the story he's selling. 12,000 years ago, whenever the Sphinx was made, somehow it survived the Nile floods, and the Nile flows, and then the Egyptians found it, and they renovated it by putting blocks on it. So Schoch agrees with me that those are phase one blocks. Those were put there 4,500 years ago, but he's still saying it's erosion. And then they recarved the head from this other one and made a nice pristine Sphinx, and they made a nice pristine valley temple. For some odd reason, they never touched the sidewalls. Why would they do that? Why would they renovate everything and leave untouched the eroded sidewalls, which is the evidence that Schoch's pointing to? He needs to explain why the ancient Egyptians would leave.
Well, he couldn't know that, of course, but he could have a theory, just like you just had a theory.
He could, but I'm like, that needs to be explained. It doesn't make sense that you'd go through all the trouble. You'd have to take the Valley Temple apart and recarve those blocks and put them back together. And how much bigger were they if you're looking at the same 3 meters to 14 meters of erosion? They did all that, but they left the sidewalls untouched.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a good question, like many of the questions that you're raising here and that others are raising. And I'm just a layman. I don't know what happened. I wasn't there, but one of the main counter arguments, I guess you could call it, to your conclusions is, as far as I've been able to find when I've looked at this, is basically that the water did actually not go that high up during the African humid period, as we mentioned, 12,000 years ago to 5,500 years ago, when it was raining, when it was a savanna, lush savanna. So they say, I mean, there are papers corroborating this, at least one of them, I will mention it. So that means that the Sphinx could not have been inundated and crumbled the way you describe it. There's a paper from 2001 showing that the sea level, Mediterranean sea level, was about 13 meters lower than it is today, 8,000 years ago, 8,000 years before present, and which means that the Nile water table of the Nile was also probably lower, and the whole. So I mean, I can't say who is right, but there are these kinds of counter arguments. You have
no, that's a good point.
Them,
I want to address that because that's really a good point. And in fact, if anything, because at one point the Mediterranean dried up, and so it was gone. It was a giant.
That's a fascinating feature. I know. Yeah.
And when that happened, the Nile cut a Grand Canyon that's 5 times longer and 25% deeper than the Grand Canyon, as did all of the rivers flowing into the Mediterranean, not just the Nile, but all these other rivers throughout the Mediterranean cut canyons. And then that filled up in like 2 years. There was like a stream capture. So the stream captured the Atlantic Ocean, and the Atlantic then in 2 years basically refilled the Mediterranean. And then the Nile Valley, the Grand Canyon, the Nile Canyon, would fill up with soft river sediments. So what that means is that the city of Cairo is sitting on top of a canyon deeper than the Grand Canyon. And the Sphinx is pretty much right on the edge of that giant canyon. And so, yes, if the ocean levels were to diminish, then the Nile would carry all that soft sediment out and would quickly adjust to whatever sea level is at that time. So yes, they could have built the Sphinx, but you got to now look at what did sea level do? And so I can't remember the exact number, but by 8,000 years ago, the sea level would have been high enough.
Well, it was 30 meters lower, according to this paper, 8,000 years ago.
Yeah, so it's in that range, and it's going to come up. And the question is, but you're also looking upstream, and there's floods, and it's narrow. So, but the odds are, it at some point it would have, and it certainly would have left. I mean, even today, are you familiar with the Nilometer?
The what?
Nilometer?
No, I'm not sure.
To me, it's like the coolest thing. I was more excited in seeing that than the Sphinx. So it's in Egypt, and it's a stream gauge. And somewhere around 4,500 years ago, if not earlier, somebody got the idea to measure the level of the Nile every day. Mm-hmm. And if you plot the level every day, then you can predict how it's going to perform on any given year. So they're using past performances. So it's basically doing statistics, and it's science. And based on the Nilometer, we know that at the highest water level, and it's almost directly side gradient to the Sphinx. So there, at one point, we know that there was 1.4 meters of water surrounding the Sphinx in today's environment. And if you were to have the Sphinx, even if for several thousand years, yeah, it certainly wasn't buried. It wasn't covered in water all of that time. But if you had it there, you'd at least see like a bathtub ring. You'd see some sign of erosion that the Nile has come through there. So, and that's the reason that the water wicks up and evaporates underneath it too, is because that was constantly being recharged by the Nile.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a given play.
Good.
That's going on there.
Yeah, good argument. I mean, who knows? You have to be an expert, and you're a geophysicist, so you know this much better than I do. And I've just perused a couple of papers and some articles about it, and so yeah, you might be right. There's also, when you talk about these things on your website, and when you explain how you came to your conclusions, you also claim that the mystery that, and now we're actually moving a little bit on to another different topic, but it's in the same area. The mystery that this advanced civilization just sprung up like that suddenly 3,500 years before our current era, or something like that, around there, like 5,000 years ago or 5,500 years ago. And you say that since we now know that the Sahara was green and it was lush, it was a savanna from 12,000 years ago to 5,500 years ago, and we have also found innumerous cave paintings and carvings in that area. We know that there were hunter-gatherers in the area, and you say that means that the mystery is solved because there were people in the area. There were. It didn't just pop up out of a desolate desert like that, because it wasn't a desert. So, and you kind of claim that means that the mystery is solved. And I'm not really convinced that the mystery is totally solved, because I still think, I mean, of course there were hunter-gatherers there, like there were hunter-gatherers all over the place, and they also say that there were hunter-gatherers in Turkey when Göbekli Tepe, which we were going to talk about later, came to be. But I mean, I still think that it was pretty sudden. It wasn't gradual, because you don't see any intermediate kind of civilization artifacts in the area. You see these. I mean, you know that there were hunter-gatherers, and then suddenly there's, I mean, this pyramids building and Sphinx building and temple building, and
yeah. I mean, I totally agree. I totally agree.
It's still a bit mysterious, isn't it?
I don't know. It does. So the Nile, it's valley itself, and I'm not the one to say most of what you just said. That's a conclusion of archaeologists and other scientists that have been looking at this. So that's not me. I wish it could be. I wish I could claim that, but I can't.
Yeah, but you say mystery solved in that text. So
yeah, I do. Well, because the Nile Valley would have, even if the Sphinx wouldn't have been, and no matter where the ocean level was, the Nile Valley itself would have been uninhabitable because of these floods until about 5,500 years ago. And so getting people suddenly appearing in the Nile Valley, and especially when you're looking at some of the best soil, some of the best farmland, I mean, it was perfect. And you didn't need to fertilize, you didn't need to do anything. You've got, so it makes perfect sense that they suddenly appear.
Yeah, but I mean, the civilization is pretty sudden. The advancement of that is sudden. And many of according to the mainstream story, I think that many of the most advanced pyramids are supposedly the ones that are oldest, and the newer ones are less impressive, which is a bit
that's
strange.
Only that it's not strange. They ran out of the good material, and then they had to use different material. That proves that they didn't have an advanced civilization, because if you and I were to build something, we'd haul it in from thousands of miles away, but they couldn't do that. So by the time, like I was pointing out with the blocks on the Sphinx, by the time the later pyramids were being built, the high quality limestone's already been depleted. And that's why they were scavenging, looting these other structures. So that's not a mystery to me. That's pretty obvious. That they weren't advanced But at the same time, you got to admit it's just amazing that they brought the granite all the way from Aswan.
That's the really big thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the granite, the hard stone structures, that's the really fascinating stuff. And these stone boxes at Serapeum and the King's Chamber, all these chambers within the Great Pyramid there. And it's really, I mean, it is impressive, and even the limestone blocks, 2.5 tons each, and that people have calculated how many of these that must have been cut and shaped and put in place every 5 minutes or so.
I know, it's just crazy.
It's just, I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense that they had slaves doing this in a primitive way.
Well, they weren't slaves.
Copper chisels. It doesn't make sense to me.
There's nobody who knows anything would say that they were slaves, because the pyramids were not built.
Or whatever they were.
They were volunteers.
With Christopher Dunn and his work around this, of course. And he's an engineer.
But they weren't slaves.
Yeah,
but they were. Yeah, I mean, how are the pyramids built? I don't know. I did get a question once from Glenn Dash, who works with Mark Lehner. I met with Mark twice. One was in Boston, and Glenn asked in an email, why is there so much water in the pyramids? And I said, well, there's two reasons why. There's a lot of water that I can think of. And, I haven't given this a lot of thought. One is that maybe it was saturated by the Green Sahara period, the African humid period. And so wherever they're quarrying this stuff, it was still saturated from that. The other one is, and I think it's more likely the case, is that they actually lubricated the ground as they were dragging these blocks. And so the pyramids are full of water because that's how and I would say that they probably use some of the sediment, the Nile River sediment, and use that as further lubrication, that soil, and put that under the blocks. So then you could just pull them up. So that's how, that you got to explain why there's so much water. And the reason he was asking is somebody was trying to use ground penetrating radar. I've never used it, and they couldn't penetrate very far into the pyramids because there's so much water. And they were thinking that it's going to be a dry environment. And then again, I did some modeling on my software, and I realized after about 10 meters, if you've got water, even in a desert, it's not getting out of there. It's going to stay inside the pyramids for a long time. I couldn't even tell you how long. The upper 10 meters, that's going to dry out pretty quick.
Okay.
But beyond that, no.
And then beneath the cuesta or the plateau, there are lots of canals still, aren't there? I mean, the area is full of underground water canals that maybe not full of water now, but have been at some point.
Oh yeah, without question. I mean, so that's how caves form. It's a classic karst limestone where you've got acidic groundwater dissolving the limestone.
Okay, so there's a lot to say about the pyramids and how they quarried how they made these granite boxes and blocks so exactly and all that. But I don't think we should maybe go.
I don't know much about that either.
No,
not my area.
Neither do I. But some people have been looking into it a lot, and it's very mysterious. I mean, even if there were not a civilization 20,000 years ago that built this and that these other people found, even if, I mean, it was actually those hunter-gatherers that suddenly started this advanced civilization and did it, they must have used some kind of advanced technology to do that. And that's impressive in and of itself, even if it happened 5,500 years ago.
What evidence do you have of advanced technology? I'm not seeing that.
The granite boxes.
No, you can just take your time and smooth it out.
You don't understand how incredibly precise they are.
I don't think you understand using that term, unfortunately. But how much time it took, and they were doing this for their gods, for their pharaohs.
Okay,
time didn't matter.
You think it was? Do you think they were graves?
Excuse me?
You think they were?
I have no idea. I mean, I can't answer that. But if you're asking me whether or not somebody could create that with the tools that they had, without question, yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't agree, but I mean, I have full respect for your opinion about this, and I mean, again, who knows? I don't know. It's just an intuitive sense. Anyway, let's talk about Göbekli Tepe, because
Perfect. Yeah.
you're also interested in that place, and that was it's a megalithic site in southern Turkey that was I think was discovered in the 40s, but it was being excavated in earnest in the mid 90s by Klaus Schmidt, I think it was called, this archaeologist who unfortunately died a few years later, and then many do, and they have been able to carbon date it, or actually they have been carbon dating material that was surrounding the megalithic structures that they've been excavating, and many say that this discovery corroborates the idea that advanced civilization started long before we're told in the textbooks and all those things, But you don't see the site in that same way, do you?
No, I mean, to me, it is an amazing site. I have not been there. I really want to go see it. And there's no question that it is a game changer for archaeology. It turned a archaeological paradigm on its head, because archaeologists were of the opinion, not having the evidence, just mentally going through that, the first thing you have to do is you start farming. That's number one on your list. And then you can settle down into communities, and then you can have excess food, and then you can have specialization, and then because of that, you could make megalithic architecture. And that takes us on the path where we are today doing a Zoom meeting. And that was, agriculture was the turning point, the invention of agriculture. Hancock is still using the outdated paradigm of farming first, that these people had to be taught how to farm. And that idea, archaeologists admit they were wrong. Hancock is wrong for saying a farming first hypothesis. Göbekli Tepe proves exactly the opposite. And it wasn't that archaeologists weren't getting there. I had an archaeologist, I forgot who, tell me it was the final nail in the coffin for the farming first hypothesis. So a little of a backstory. So it was actually in 1964, if I remember right, there was a group of archaeologists from the University of Chicago and University of Istanbul, and they were doing reconnaissance in the area, and they identified Göbekli Tepe as one of the principal sites that they wanted to investigate. They couldn't do that because they had to do what's called rescue archaeology at a site about 27 miles away. I don't know what that is in kilometers.
27 miles?
Yeah.
That's about 43 kilometers, something like that.
Yeah, it's not far. It's close. So, and that was rescue archaeology because they were putting in a dam, and this site would be then put underwater. And Klaus Schmidt was a graduate student working on that site. And the Valley Quarry is the first place where they found the T-pillars. So when Klaus Schmidt was looking for his own site, now that he's got his PhD, and then the first time that they were able to choose a site as opposed to having it selected for them because of the rescue archaeology, he chose Göbekli Tepe. And he probably, because the tops of the T-pillars were already exposed, and he's already seen T-pillars, so he probably even knew or really suspected that there were T-pillars there. And from a geological standpoint, Göbekli Tepe would stand out like a sore thumb, because there's all this relatively flat-lying limestone slabs that are in the area, not far from where Göbekli, right on that hill. And that's what they mined. But then on top of it, you got all this gravel. You got all these pieces of gravel and things. And where did that come from? That doesn't belong there. That's not natural. I would look at that and I'd say, there's something going on here. So it turns out that they had on that trip, and I only learned this recently, I suspected it, but on that trip, they had a guy named Jack Harlan. And Jack Harlan is a botanist. And he was there to identify the grains that they were collecting as archaeologists, to identify whether or not these grains were domesticated or wild varieties. So that was Jack Harlan's second trip to Göbekli Tepe. On his first trip, one of the things he collected, because he's a botanist, some wild grain. And he took the wild grain and he brought it back to Chicago. And even as he collected it, he didn't think it had much value. And it turns out that a few years later, there was a disease that infected the wheat. And this particular variety that he brought back, so he started collecting these grains. And the Svalbard seed bank in Norway, right next to you.
Mm-hmm.
Gary Fowler, who says it was Jack Harlan who inspired him to build the seed bank because of the work that he did. So Jack Harlan was on his second trip in Turkey, and he is now there, and the archaeologists are out in the field doing their stuff, and he decides one day he's going to go out and collect some grain because he saw all this wild grain naturally growing all around him. And he went out there with his hands and he stripped the wheat for an hour and put it into a sack. And he said, I can't do this very well. I've got the soft hands of a professor. If I were better at it, if I didn't have these hands, I could do a lot more. So he told the archaeologists that evening what he did. And they suggested, or somewhere it came up, that he make a sickle. So he took the actual stone blades that the archaeologists were finding and made a sickle and went out the next day and for an hour again cut grain and took that back to Chicago. His conclusion after examining it was that a family of 4 working for 3 weeks could collect more wild grain than they could eat in a year. There's your answer. They didn't need farming. They had the wild grains. They had these resources. They're called affluent foragers. And on top of that, they had the herd animals coming through that are eating these grains seasonally coming through.
So the significance of this is that structures like these could very well have been built by hunter-gatherers. Is that what you're saying?
Well, so it destroyed the farming first hypothesis. So they settled down because the area was so rich in resources.
Okay.
So the idea that you have to have the farming first, which is what Hancock is still selling, is outdated and no longer thought to be true.
I understand. Yeah, I understand. But that still doesn't say that this was not an advanced structure in some way. I mean, it's not as advanced as the Great Pyramid, of course, and as the Baalbek or the Kailasa Temple or many other places. But it's pretty big stones anyway. And anyway, also the dating is, of course, of the material that surrounded the probably intentionally buried site. You would agree with that?
So right now they're not sure.
They're not sure if it was intentionally buried, but it was buried, and so they haven't, of course, been able to date the actual stones because you can't date stone, which is sad.
Well, you can do luminescence dating to some extent.
Yeah, luminescence. That's an interesting method. Have they been able to use that in some?
So I don't know much about that. What's interesting is that, as I understand it, has to be like quartz or feldspar in the rock, and so the limestone.
And it has to be enclosures that have been dark for millennia for it to be any point with it, hasn't it?
So if there's any rock in the wall, you could just move it, and then you could date it that way. But I'm not sure you could do it with limestone. But then at the same time, I've been working on the Sphinx and a paper on that, and there have people. It's been done on limestone, and everything I know about that method says you can't do that, but they did it. So I don't know. It's not my area.
Well, it's fascinating. I would like to know more about that method because I mean that would change a lot, I guess, if it were to be, used in many of these significant places.
So Klaus Schmidt, I want to say Klaus Schmidt.
Yes.
So one of the ideas that again Hancock and such people are selling is that the older structures, as you already pointed out with the pyramid, I don't know why this is such an interesting line to them, are larger. And that is supposedly and appears to be true at Göbekli Tepe. And yet, only at the time that I wrote my paper that was in Skeptic magazine, about 5% of the site had been excavated, and they had done ground penetrating radar there, and it worked. And they mapped significantly larger circles, enclosures. So, and then also Klaus Schmidt, I have a video where he was on a documentary and he said that he believes the Göbekli Tepe is 14, perhaps 15,000 years old. So using the larger, older, and Klaus Schmidt saying this, Göbekli Tepe is not tied to the younger Dryas. The idea that the Sphinx and the Göbekli Tepe and here in the States, I don't know if you're familiar, they've suddenly become very enamored with the channeled Scablands. And all of this stuff has to line up with the younger Dryas. And none of it does.
Well,
none of it does.
No, well, I know, but especially when you talk about Göbekli Tepe, I think that, for instance, Andrew Collins has this thesis that the inscriptions and the symbolism on the T-pillars have to do with warnings about a cataclysm that originates in the sky, so that people wouldn't, heed the warning to the future, so to speak. But as you say, if it's 15,000 years old, it's way older than that. So yeah.
Yeah, so if it's 15,000 years old, then it predates the Younger Dryas by 2,000 years.
Yes, it does.
So, and the evidence is building that is the case. So, yeah, what were you going to say?
I was just going to move over to the thing about the discussion with these people. You mentioned Hancock. That's Graham Hancock, and he's probably known to most of the people listening to this. Another independent investigator, researcher. He's a journalist originally, and also Randall Carlson, of course, is one of these people who are doing these things, and he's been talking about Göbekli Tepe a lot, but especially, and I think you have reached out to Randall to have a debate with him, but no luck so far. Is that correct?
Well, he was on Uncharted X, and he said that he would go toe-to-toe with any geologist. He goes, I got my 20,000 papers. I may not have published, and he's like that. And I was like, okay. And I was like, so I wrote to Ben at Uncharted X and never got a response. And I wrote to Randall Carlson and I never got a response. So then, like I said, I go out to Utah a lot. I was out that way twice last year, once whitewater rafting and another time to watch the eclipse. So in almost the very spot, and in fact, I watched the eclipse from the very spot Randall Carlson was supposed to show up. He never did. But I tracked him down at his hotel in Mexican Hat. If you've ever been there, it's just a dot on the map. There's like 3 hotels. So it wasn't difficult. And as I assumed, they were out back. They were by the swimming pool. And so I said, you said you're willing to go toe-to-toe with anyone. And he goes, yeah. I said, has anyone ever taken you up on that? And he goes, no. And I said, well, I will. And he actually said he doesn't know much about Göbekli Tepe because we kind of went back and forth. And I said, well, I know the Sphinx and I know Göbekli Tepe. At that point, I really didn't know the channeled Scablands. And he said that he knew the Sphinx and the Scablands, but didn't know much about Göbekli Tepe. So, yeah, so he's ghosted me.
But he said he would go toe-to-toe about the Sphinx at least, and maybe other topics as well.
Yeah, and then Joe Rogan, a year ago, November, asked, is there anyone who'd debate you? And I was really annoyed because Carlson said, you won't find anyone. And I'm like, well, who am I? And I went, because I didn't know the channeled Scablands, I went out and I spent thousands of dollars to take a field trip by the principal investigators, thinking he's a man of his word. Well, he's not. He agreed. We shook hands. Where is he? And then Rogan puts this forward.
We don't know what happened. I mean, maybe he has good reasons for this. I don't know. You don't know, but it doesn't. I mean, it sounds like he should take the debate with you. I agree, but I mean, who knows?
He shook hands, no matter what.
Yeah, sure.
I was really nice, and I even left them some beer because they had a whole group, and I could see they were running low on beer. So
by the way, have you reached out to Robert Schoch or Graham Hancock?
I have not. I have not. I haven't tried contacting them. Like I say, this whole started because I'm trying to respond to his call for debate. I'm not the one calling for a debate.
No,
I'm trying to respond to his call. So no, I haven't because I'm more reacting than I am acting on that. I will, I got my day job. I'm doing other things, but I will get there.
Yeah.
And if they don't want to debate me, then they've got enough stuff on the internet. I can go through it and dissect what they said, as I did on my webpage when, for instance, Randall Carlson was saying why the floods were higher. I mean, he's somewhat right about the description during the African humid period, where he says anything in the Nile Valley would be destroyed, and I agree 100%. But he said that came from the overtopping of Lake Victoria. It definitely did not. I can prove that. But he's right about the amount of flows. So yeah.
Yeah.
I can.
And speaking of
I'm
flows,
not afraid.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, good. And Randall Carlson, if you are by any chance listening to this, take up this challenge here. But speaking of flows, one of Randall's favorite cases in point, I guess, when it comes to the indications of a cataclysm during the Younger Dryas period, is as you have been mentioning already, the channeled Scablands, which is up in Washington State. Is it also in Idaho and Montana a little bit, or is it mainly?
Exactly, you got it.
Yeah, it's up in the northwestern part of the United States, and the landscape is spectacular. It's fantastic. I haven't been there, but I've seen the pictures, and I mean, he's Carlson's idea here is, I suppose, that this happened during brief periods of time when the ice from the last ice age melted extremely fast, and enormous amounts of water just poured over, was flowing over the landscape there, and created all these chasms and gorges and all kinds of things. And so, where does Carlson go wrong on this topic?
Oh, he's wrong in a lot. I'm just pulling up another slide here. Give me a second. I wanted to show this one briefly. The depiction that everyone shows is pretty much the one that says 18,000 years ago, and that definitely is the extent of the ice 18,000 years ago. But by 13,000 years ago, that ice has retreated half the way up to Hudson Bay. And so even if you were, which I doubt it was a comet, melted all of that, it's not going to go down the Columbia. It's not going to get into Washington State. So this is where I say they went wrong, is that, what they used to talk in very vague terms. And now Carlson and Hancock and Schoch, even, everybody is now fixated on the Younger Dryas. And all I have to do at this point is say it didn't happen at the Younger Dryas. So exactly what the megafloods are, people are still working on. So if you
when do you think this happened? Long before, or?
So the thing is that yes, without question, because so not only do we have this depiction here, I can stop sharing. Stop share. So not only do we have that depiction there, but there is lake varves. Are you familiar with lake varves?
No, not sure.
So what happens, because like you're in an area where this would happen with any of the lakes. Right now, the lake outside my window across the street is frozen over. There's a layer of ice. And so it's not getting any sediments now. And then in the summer, it's going to get all the sediments. And in the fall, and when there's storms, things are going to come in. And then again, and so it creates these layer after layer after layer that you can count like tree rings. And it's just muck. It's just soft muck. You could go down there and dig it up with your hands. It's just layer upon layer is being deposited at the bottom of the lake. There's a similar deposit just downstream from Dry Falls. And it is in, so it could not have been there. So the mega floods are removing bedrock. They're tearing away bedrock. It's going to leave this soft sediment. How could it possibly leave a soft sediment directly downstream, down in that valley? And so whenever this lake varve was being deposited, that proves that the mega floods had to occur prior to that. And it has one of the few volcanic eruptions in it. So now we have something we can date. And it's dated to 13,600 years ago. So roughly 1,000 years prior to the Younger Dryas. So all of the floods, without question, occurred prior to 13,600 years ago. There is no evidence of a mega flood going down through the area at any point at the Younger Dryas. And in fact, it's impossible because going back to that slide that I showed, there's an Okanagan lobe. And what that did is it dammed the Columbia River and it produced Glacial Lake Columbia. So there's Glacial Lake Missoula. I don't know if you're seeing this. Yeah, so Glacial Lake Missoula is over here. It's flooding, and then it flooded into Glacial Lake Columbia, and then that overtopped, and it sent the water to the higher ground. So if this ice dam isn't here, it's going to go down the Columbia. Mm. And by 13,000 years ago, the Okanagan lobe is gone. Mm. So even if you did melt it, it would go down the Columbia. It would not go to the higher ground and create the Scablands. So he can't possibly be right. Mm. There's other pieces of information on that. There's these rhythmites. And the rhythmites, and I've seen where, I wish I could see more, where Randall Carlson went there and he's saying, And geologists were questioning this. So there's layer upon layer. What it seems like is that there was a flood, and then you're in the slack water way off on the side. And there was this loess, this glacial loess, this very fine, silty soil. So it's going to be carried in suspension. But if you're in the slack water way off on the sides, that's going to settle out. And of course, the material will settle first, and then you'll get a layer, and that would be a flood. And then you get another flood coming in, and it produce another layer. Or, as Carlson likes to point out, and it's been speculated, is that maybe those are just increases where the flood is going up and down. So the water coming downstream is going sometimes a little bit higher, sometimes a little bit lower. And that's all produced by one flood, not multiple floods.
Yeah.
But again, there's a volcanic ash in here, and it's dated to 16,000 years ago. Of course, Carlson doesn't mention that. And again, it proves that they're all older. So as Hancock likes to say, stuff keeps getting older. And it is. It's all older than the younger Dryas. That doesn't help him. He wants
not the stuff that he wants to get older, gets older, but other stuff.
So he wants to make things younger, and they're not. They're getting older.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't know about the Scablands and the geology around all these things, but probably as well as I do here that there are other things pointing to some possible cataclysm that happened during the Younger Dryas, whatever it was, if it was a comet impact, or if it was a solar outburst, or if it was something else, who knows. For instance, this black mat that you can find in not all continents, but I think 3 out of all of the continents, I think North America, Europe, Asia, you find this black mat, and it corresponds to that. If you look at the layers in the ground, I think it corresponds with that period, which could indicate that there had been massive wildfires, forest fires all over the world for some reason. And then there's also this extinction of the megafauna, which coincides more or less with this period. And in South America, I think about 80% of the megafauna died out. And in North America, it was something like that, 60 or 70%. Less so in Africa, because Africa seems to have not been impacted that much, because as we know, they still have the megafauna, most of the megafauna, but there were a lot of these animals. And then there are these, I think, a bit ridiculous theories that a few tens of thousands of hunters actually killed them. Hunted them to extinction.
I don't think that's so ridiculous. So what happened is you've got animals that were living and evolved to live in an ice age, and then the climate warms, and to that you add hunters, and there's no question that human hunters were taking out a lot of mammoths. There's the Stefan Milo has recently put out where there's like 63 mammoth skulls in this thing, which some people call a structure. And he's saying, no, he's thinking that's just where they put their meat, in the bones, kind of like their dump. and there's no question that they made homes out of tusks, mammoth tusks. So, but add to that the fact that humans are creating fire and burning the land and changing the land. So you're taking an animal that's designed to live in the ice age, bringing it into a warmer climate, then putting stress on it from hunting, and then changing the environment. So it was a multiple of various things. And the megafauna didn't just die out 12,000 years ago. There were mammoths living on Wrangel Island in Siberia as the Sphinx was being built. 4,500 years ago.
I know that not every individual died out same time, but still.
And wherever you go, be it Australia, be it Madagascar, be it any place, the extinctions occur with the arrival of humans, shortly after the arrival of humans.
Yeah, well, it depends on what you look for. If you look for the humans being the culprit of every evil thing on this planet, then you will find it, if you look for it.
I don't think I find that interesting. That's kind of a side note.
Because the megafauna of Australia, that the arrival of humans was not at the time as that they say it was. I mean, they have predated that now. Anyway, I should have had the paper with me to. Well,
Australia is an interesting thing because carbon-14 dating, you can only go back about 40,000 years. You can't use it beyond that, and that's kind of pushing it. So it's only because of other dating techniques that they're finally able to resolve what's happening in what happened in Australia.
Yeah.
And yeah, it looks like it's tied in with the people getting there. To me, the most amazing thing was to learn about Megalania. Are you familiar with that?
Megalania. Is that
Yeah.
an ancient continent or something?
No, Megalania was a giant monitor lizard, like 27
okay,
feet long,
mm-hmm.
and it was venomous. And it was in Australia when the humans got there. I mean, it could take a human in a single bite. And Tim Flannery, Australian geologist, describes it as a respectably sized T-Rex. Mm-hmm. And that was there when humans got to Australia.
That's pretty fascinating. Well, I know that in recent times, it's been fairly proven that humans have been able to hunt birds to extinction in the Pacific. There were, I think, several hundred species of birds that went extinct when Polynesians came there 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So I guess, yeah, it's an argument. I think that the big megafauna extinction thing is a little bit hard to wrap my mind around, that humans at that level of civilization, unless there was an advanced civilization that actually did this. Then if it was, if it was primitive, I think it was a bit difficult. It's a bit difficult to imagine. But anyway.
Well, I think so. I wanted to come back to something you said because I thought it was really pertinent, and it is where things are, and that is what happened at the Younger Dryas? We're still debating that. That exactly what happened, why it happened, but Hancock and Carlson, they're saying no. They know it was comets. And I'm like, no. The consensus is that's still being debated. And
Schoch doesn't think it was a comet. He thinks more that there was an unstable sun, primarily.
I know he gets into the whole solar. What he does is just crazy because he takes the Younger Dryas and turns it into a hot, wet period. He's saying there's all these mega floods. Well, during the Younger Dryas was a cold, dry period. So he's got that backwards. So
first there was this Allerud Bölling period when it was
the Bölling Allerud, yeah. That was
so 15,000. And then there was the Younger Dryas when it got colder pretty fast. And
right. But Schoch has it being a wetter period that these solar flares came in and created all this precipitation.
Are you sure? Have you read his papers?
He says this all the time. And,
okay.
Even the Wikipedia entry will tell you the opposite.
Oh, Wikipedia. They have
I know for what it's worth.
All these policemen.
but without question, the Younger Dryas was a cold, dry period. And so when you have a desert Sahara is when you have a glacial period. And so you get a green Sahara when you're in an interglacial. And Schoch has that backwards. And that, I'm like, how can he do that? I mean, it's so blatant that everyone knows the timing of these events. So everyone knows when that's well dated.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. Yeah. Well, let's look at the big picture a little bit. I know you want to talk about that as well, and we have already. But a couple of questions before we wrap this up about the big picture and the big scientific picture of where we come from and what the heck is going on this planet. You say again from your website, you write using little more than the water erosion hypothesis for the Sphinx, alternative archaeologists want to rewrite the entire prehistory of humans. And I think it's maybe a little bit unfair because many of these independent researchers, they point to, innumerous, as we have been talking about here, advanced structures, and there are more than those that we have mentioned. Göbekli Tepe and loads of pyramids and temples in Egypt. And there's also Baalbek, there's the Barabar caves and the Kailasa temple in India. There's Easter Island, the Muay on Easter Island. There's Gunung Padang. There's Tiwanaku, Sacsayhuaman, Cusco, all these places in Peru and Bolivia that you're familiar with. I don't know if you've been there, but I went there a couple of years ago. And there are pyramids on all continents that with odd similarities and oddly geometrically exact structures on the seafloor as well. And then, of course, there are we already mentioned the Younger Dryas extremes, the impact hypothesis, and there's Also, we haven't mentioned all these accounts in ancient texts. We have, Plato's account, of course, but I mean, not only that, we have other ancient texts. We have more than 200 flood myths all around the world. And I think personally that's all science, geology, and archaeology in particular should actually take these ancient texts seriously, because they kind of dismiss them as fairy tales, which I think is a bit
No, that's not.
unfair.
That is not the case. I don't have it with me. That last point. I have a textbook that was written by one of the geology professors here in Madison, and he starts out with the story of Atlantis in his historical geology book, and he points to Santorini. And are you familiar with that?
Yes. I know that Santorini had a giant volcanic eruption around 1500 BC or something.
And he's using ancient texts and evidence to make his claim on that. And so, no, they do that. The problem is Santorini, when it blew up, the Sphinx was already 1,000 years old. So Hancock and those guys aren't going to point to that because that doesn't fit their idea. And you are naming all these different places around the world. Most of those are not that old. Easter Island was like 1300 AD.
But you have the sediments. You know that the Moai are standing there. I mean, 2/3 of them are beneath the ground, and the sedimentation would take much longer time to reach that level than.
Well, maybe they were buried.
Years.
I mean, even so, not being able to answer Easter Island doesn't make it older and doesn't make it part of an advanced civilization. If somebody did that 1300 years ago,
you don't think this is mysterious at all? You just think, yeah, well,
that's a no-brainer. They could do that. Look at the chapels that were built in Europe during the Middle Ages. I mean, people were doing amazing things. And around that same time,
yeah,
I'm going to look at something like, those chapels as being far more spectacular than Easter Island. And they're roughly in this, couple hundred years. I don't know the exact dates, but they're not all that far apart.
A lot older, but I mean, I know that what the standard story around that is, and so what are the main blind spots among these independent researchers? Would you say, if you have a list?
Blind spots.
I guess there are different blind spots in different people, but still.
Well, I think everyone's got blind spots. I mean, we all can convince ourselves of things. So I don't know. It's just unique to them. I think that's kind of. So that's what science is all about: is to take your idea and throw it out there and see what people make of it. And you don't disparage them for having disagreed with you, which is what Hancock and Carlson and Schoch are doing. We're just not ready. We're just not open-minded enough. I have my own biases. Well, maybe it's the other way around. But yeah, I mean, we all have our blind spots. I think what they do is they kind of work with a gotcha moment. So if they find a piece of evidence like Randall Carlson finding the overtopping of Lake Victoria as evidence of what caused the floods in the Nile Valley, but he's wrong because he already has his answer. And when you think you have the answer, you stop looking. And that would be my answer to Schoch and Carlson and Hancock. They've stopped looking. They already have their answers, and I just need to be informed of what they know to be true.
Or maybe they continue looking where they have found stuff that they didn't see before, and they continue looking there where the mainstream archaeology hasn't even gone there yet. I mean, that's also an explanation.
They're not having, I think Hancock thinks he's having an impact on mainstream archaeology and Randall Carlson. So I asked, this is kind of a side tangent, nobody knows of them. And the people who do know of them don't have a high opinion of them. They just think these are just crazy ideas not worth discussing. So they're having an impact.
They say that too. I mean, they say that they're not being listened to by the mainstream. That's what they say also.
But they haven't made their point. If I'm trying to, it's my responsibility if I'm saying that everyone is wrong about the Sphinx, including Schoch, because he says everyone's wrong, and I agree with him. I'm going to say everyone's wrong, including Schoch. So that's the only difference between me and Schoch is I'm saying he's also wrong. But they're just not open-minded. They're not looking, they're not making any difference. They don't know who they are. I asked Richard Waite, and he had no idea. And Richard Waite is one of the principal investigators of the channel Scablands. And I asked, and they make it sound, and I talked about this couple of times. So Carlson in particular makes it sound like he's speaking for geologists, speaking for Bretts, when he's explaining what that was all about. So Vic Baker is one of the principal investigators of the Scablands and looking at similar features that cut the English Channel and similar features on Mars caused by megafloods. And he knew Bretts. And I asked him if he had any thoughts on what Bretts would make of people like Hancock. And his response was instantly was he would be incensed. So Hancock is not speaking for Bretts.
No, but I mean the fact that the majority of academics don't even know who these people are or don't agree with them doesn't convince me that these independent researchers are wrong, because I mean the only thing that is important is whether they have a point or not, and you're saying that
exactly.
they don't have it in many instances. But I mean, isn't it the case that it sometimes is difficult? I mean, you're actually an independent researcher yourself nowadays, aren't you? Or are you?
I'm independent, and I'm having my own issues, and I have to explain why I should be listened to. But I understand that.
Yeah,
I'm not going to say the problem is them.
I appreciate that. I love that you're an independent researcher.
And people like Schoch, and Hancock are not making it easier.
Yeah, I understand. But would you agree that it's difficult sometimes to change established academic paradigms? Because I mean, as they say, the winners are the victors write the history. So those who have been victorious in a field, they want to, they are what's the word? They want to stonewall what they've found and where they are.
Yeah.
And they're very
without question that happens. So but it doesn't prove there's a lost civilization, and it doesn't make them right.
I know, but
yes, that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Without question. I mean, Alfred Wegener on plate tectonics would be a classic example.
Exactly. I was going to talk about that. I mean, there are so many theories that have been considered crazy not so long ago. You have this continental drift theory. You have the theory that dinosaurs once roamed the Earth, and the theory that rocks occasionally fall to Earth from the sky, and the Milankovitch cycles.
I forgot about that one.
And that Homo sapiens might be 300,000 years old, not 50,000 years old, as I was told when I went to school. And the discovery of the mythical city of Troy, as you're familiar with, I suppose.
Not really.
I mean, it was considered a fairy tale by Homer, but then actually an archaeologist found Troy in the 1800s. So, I mean, there are so many stories where mavericks have pushed the envelope and made the mainstream change their mind after a while.
But there's also plenty of mavericks who are mavericks we don't hear about because their ideas were so ridiculous.
Well, of course.
There's one Randolph Kirkpatrick. So if you look at the Sphinx, if you look at it, it has Nummulites giziensis, this single-cell organism that's about that big around, and it's almost limestone forming. I mean, it makes it up. And it was an Egyptian god, and it was actually one of the early games that the Egyptians played. It was a board game. And this guy, Randolph Kirkpatrick, studied sponges and his respectable papers on the sponge, but he decided that you can find this online, he wrote a book called The Nummulosphere. So it turns out that all rocks, according to him, all rocks, igneous rocks, metamorphic rocks, sedimentary rocks, even meteors, were actually colonies of these single-cell organisms. And he
that's a pretty far-out theory, I must say.
but he did, and we don't hear about that one because that one's wrong.
Well, that's of course the case. I mean,
so we're selectively choosing how many others are there that aren't like Alfred Wegener, and we're right, and how many of these other crazy ideas were just plain wrong. So when you're selecting and saying, okay, only these people actually are contributing. Well, Randolph Kirkpatrick didn't contribute anything, and nobody's going to bring it up. And that's why. So, I mean, I can't tell you how many others there are. I mean, if you want to laugh, read that book. I remember reading it one night because you can find it online. I'm just bursting out laughing at this. So, we know about the ones that work. But I do want to say something. I do think that my own personal experience, my friends are sending me emails and texting that they just saw me again on public television. Because I did a Wednesday night at the lab, and those get aired here. And I've since learned that in many cities around the United States. I'm like, oh my goodness. I'm not one of the people who'd ever want to do a show like that. I'm not the person who wants to get out there and get into the public limelight. That's just not me. And then also, when I sat down and started learning about the geology of the Sphinx, it started in the Eocene, and I had the opinion that there really wasn't much that's happened since the demise of the dinosaurs. And I couldn't be more wrong. I could tell you some fascinating stories that are true, and I about global warming events and
Yes, have a
human
lot of
evolution.
to do about the climate. I saw that in your what you
And
had
then
read. That's
and then
fascinating.
I'll take it to the next step is I have met. So I've been to places I never imagined I'd go to Egypt, but I've been to Egypt. And I went to the Scablands and I met the principal investigators. I did things, I learned things, and experienced things that I never would have if not for them. And one of the things that really stood out for me, Mark Lehner is not unusual in his background in archaeology to have gone there to prove the Hall of Records. A lot of people, surprisingly large number of archaeologists, actually were inspired by Indiana Jones and Lost Civilizations and all that. And they realized very quickly that, that's not the case. But nonetheless, like Mark, they became really good archaeologists. And perhaps, and there's no question that Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock and Robert Schoch are reaching a really wide audience. And some of them are getting really excited about learning about geology in the world we live in. They're asking the right questions. So in the long run, they're doing some really good. I mean, me personally, I would have to say that I would never have done those things.
Yeah.
I never would have learned many of the things if it weren't for them. So I think there's a real positive side to what they're doing. I think what they're also selling, which we're not getting anywhere, at least in the United States, is good, fun, big picture science programs on television. We're not getting that, and I think they're selling that. And I think there's a real hunger for that kind of a story to learn what is our past, how do we get here, and that just keeps getting refined all the time. And that's not, but that refinement is not coming from the alternative archaeologists, whatever you want to call them, because they've already got their answers. It's the younger Dryas. End of story. We're done. They're not looking for something else. They're not questioning that. And yet things are still being questioned.
Well, they came to that conclusion around the 90s. I think Graham Hancock was one of the first, and then others have followed. So, I mean, they've been on the younger Dryas for 20 to 30 years now. But maybe they will change that as well. I mean, who knows? They are also, of course, evolving just like the mainstream. So you could, I think it's maybe not really fair to say that they have just set in stone exactly what happened, and that's never going to change.
So, I mean, for instance, the demise of the dinosaurs has been ascribed to an asteroid impact, and yet there's geologists out there looking right now to say that it isn't that, and that kind of like the Megafauna extinction, they were already on a decline when the asteroid hit. And what's that all about? And and it turns out that that was a crater. The Chicxulub crater was 150 kilometers across. Well, there's another crater 37 million years ago in Siberia that's 100 kilometers across, second largest impact crater in the last half billion years, and yet it didn't do anything to the geologic record. The animals just passed through it like nothing happened.
Yeah.
So the idea that the asteroids, these impacts are causing the extinctions is in the popular mainstream, with people, but the scientists are saying, well, okay, explain this. And so the idea that once you find an answer, you can ascribe it everywhere. You can test that hypothesis, but it might not be true.
We are working with hypotheses, and I totally agree that people should be more humble, perhaps on all sides around this, because we're constantly learning new things, and nobody knows exactly what happened. And we can have all kinds of hypotheses, and as long as we don't know exactly what happened, I think it's everybody's right to have a well thought through hypothesis and present that, and then it's up to everybody to assess whether it's credible or not. But
I'm working on. I was just going to say I'm working on my Sphinx paper right now, and I had David Miano look at it, and he asked for something. I'm like, oh, we can't do that. That's just insane. But in the long run, it really helped. But I haven't published it because I want to make sure it's my responsibility to make sure that people understand what I'm saying. And if they fail to, and Schoch has failed to convince the geologists and the archaeologists, that's a failure on his part. I need to make it as clear as possible what I see, and then what they need to do as clear as possible is destroy it, to say that it's not right, because that's what science do. And I'm not going to be upset if what I put together is wrong. I'm going to go, oops, my bad, I missed that. I'm not defensive on it. I'm just going to say, look, this is my best guess. This is what I see. This is what's going on. And I hope that it adds some part to the story that's reasonable. But to take, I mean, so when I watched part of Schoch on your episode, and boy, does he just lay it into the archaeologists for saying that they're just not open to ideas. Well, maybe he's not open to him being wrong. He needs to, because I put the responsibility on me, and I also put the responsibility on him. So he doesn't talk to geologists about the A word, as Schoch calls it, because we're just not ready for the A word, which is Atlantis. No, geologists are open. To lump all the thousands of geologists in one group and say they're not open to this, what he's saying, what I'm hearing is he can't defend it. So he's not going to bring up the A word because he knows he cannot defend it.
Well, of course,
I'm willing to talk about anything.
Defend the view that I have evidence that Atlantis existed. No one can defend that. But you can have the hypothesis, and you can work on the hypothesis, and you can have all kinds of ideas around whether it was in the Azores or whether you can find remnants of it in places. And I mean, you know all this. There's nothing wrong in having a hypothesis, but you can't say that I have evidence, because that's
there's no evidence. And I would ask, so it's a seafaring nation. Do I have that right?
Well, there are. Yes, I mean, partly seafaring. I mean, there are all kinds of stories.
So my question is, where are the artifacts that could only have come from Atlantis? There should be archaeological evidence of things where people are going to say, where was this mined? Where was this built? Where did this come from? There's things that people have identified have gotten all the way up into England from Roman times and all over different places. Where? So it's a seafaring nation. They were trading with other people. Where's the debris? Where's the stuff?
Well, metal would have corroded by now, wouldn't it?
Well, the metal may have, but you'd have pots, you'd have artwork, you'd have.
Well, some would say that the evidence is staring you in the face. For instance, talking about artifacts, what they found beneath the Djoser pyramid in Egypt, for instance, all these stone vases that are not. It's not pottery. It's granite.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah,
and other they have done this with. I mean, the precision is incredible, and you can't do that with a basic lathe even, and they don't even think that they had lathes.
It's not that hard. I had a British car. I didn't learn. Bought two of them actually. So I had a 1970. I had a TR7. If you're familiar with those.
No.
So it was the shape of things to come, and it had electronic ignition. And I was a poor college student. The electronic ignition went. It was $400. So that would have been then. That's quite a bit of money. That's like over $1,000. I don't know, maybe $2,000 today. And I was like, I don't have that kind of money to fix this car. But what I could do is maybe convert this electronic ignition back to points. So I rewired the car to work on points. And it was a 4-cylinder engine, so I needed something that would fit over the shaft that the electronic pickup was on, that would pick it up. And I needed something on there that would ride like the points would ride on. So I looked around in the garage and I found a piece of metal, and it fit right over. And I took a file and I put it into a vise, and I filed 4 flats on this otherwise round object. So then the points would ride on that. And I put it on, and I had to adjust it to get the timing right. And I put it on, and I wired it up, and the car starts. So now everyone's going to tell you need to machine that in a machine shop. And I also repaired an engine one time, and I took it all apart, and I was like, well, I should have these borings, the pistons, I should have them bored out. But I didn't. I just put on bigger rings, and I figured And the car ran, and it ran 50,000 miles. So the idea that you have to have this high technology to do things, no. If you know how it works, there's other ways around that. So shaping metal to get it, to do things, I've done that in ways that should not have worked, but did work because I knew what I was doing. And I don't see these people were every bit as smart as you and I. They were more religious. They were very, they were very committed to what was going on in their communities. Like the way, I mean, when they were building the cathedrals in Europe, these people are living in huts. Not maybe not huts, but nowhere near as sophisticated. So there's a trend where people do those sorts of things. I don't find any of that being difficult to comprehend. The amount of time is just mind-boggling, and we're too lazy to put in time to do things like that.
Well, good points there. What I appreciate very much with you is that you are an independent researcher yourself, which shows that, you're a living proof that you don't have to be, quote unquote, chained by academia to lean towards the standard explanations, which is, fascinating. And I'm glad you wanted to be a guest on the show. And Bob,
Thanks.
Where can people find out more about you and your work now?
So that's a good question. I haven't updated my webpage in a while. I need to do so, but I've got a webpage, robertschneiker.com, and I go through and I outline the basics of my research. And I am currently working on a couple of papers, one on the Sphinx. So hopefully that will be like a game changer. I'm on the verge of getting it done. I don't consider myself much of a writer. So and again, I say I have the responsibility. So look for a paper coming out on that. So at some point this year, hopefully.
But people can go to your website, robertschneiker.com.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
and if you got any questions, and I look for comments in the videos when people post them. So
sure.
Definitely.
And I put the link in the description box as always.
And I will try to answer. I'm not going to. One of the things I've learned is like I've heard back from most of the scientists that I've contacted, and I've heard back from none of the alternative archaeologists that I've contacted. So, I mean,
okay. Hopefully we'll have a debate
here
with Randall or Graham or any of the others at some point.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, it was really a pleasure talking.
Yes.
I like sharing the ideas. I like the fact that I think what we share, I think all of us share, is a real interest in how we got here.
Yeah.
Who we are, how we got here. And to me, that is the real question.
That's the core question. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining the show.
Thank you.
And good luck now.
Thank you.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and don't forget to hit that like button and share the video with your friends. Please support the channel if you can. I appreciate all the support. You can become a Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal if you wish. All the links are in the description box below. Thank you.